Today we are going to be taking a look at a moment in American history when, in 1823, the United States said to Europe, "No, no, no!" And that moment is with a document or a speech called the Monroe Doctrine. So let's take a look. First off, the key concept for today is this: U.S. interest in increasing foreign trade, expanding its national borders, and isolating itself from European conflicts shaped the nation's foreign policy and spurred government and private initiatives. Boring! Here's the breakdown. Throughout the early 19th century, much of Latin America was experiencing revolution.
You say you want a revolution.
And these revolutions, in many cases, were successful. For example, in 1821, Mexico had gained its independence from Spain, and throughout Latin America, you had these independent nations forming. And the United States is interested in this because, one, these are new republics. We want to form relations with them, but also for more practical reasons. If Spain or other European powers have been kicked out, we have an opportunity to trade with them. There's no more mercantile restrictions placed on these places if they're no longer colonies. So the United States was looking at these revolutions and kind of, interested in what's going on. Now keep in mind, Napoleon's defeated in 1815 over in Europe, and a lot of monarchies are restored to power. And in particular in France and Austria and Prussia and Russia, there was efforts by the monarchs, by the conservatives, to suppress liberal movements in places like Spain and Italy, but also there was some interest in helping Spain return to power in South America. And the United States does not want this. Another concern was Russia was creeping around. In fact, in 1821, Russia had claimed territory all the way into Alaska and down into what is today British Columbia. They even had trading posts as far south as San Francisco Bay, down in this area. And there was a real fear that Russia would expand into California. And there's this fear that if Russia takes over this area, that it will cut off the United States from ever having an opportunity to reach the Pacific Ocean. And so American policymakers are trying to figure out how to respond. Monroe is the president at the time, President James Monroe, and he's looking at the Western Hemisphere, and there's this real fear amongst his people, especially his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, that these dangers were in fact real. What if the European countries help Spain win back their former colonies? What if Russia encroaches further southward along the Pacific coast? And the reality is, both President James Monroe and his Secretary of State want to protect these new republics in the Western Hemisphere and also guarantee our access to trade. Now, a former foe actually approaches these men with an offer.
From London.
The British Foreign Secretary, George Cannon, proposes a joint Anglo-American warning. Say, hey, why don't we, together, England and America, warn European powers to stay the heck out of Latin America? Let's kind of join forces and basically say, hey, hands off. And England, with its very powerful navy, really would be able to guarantee that this warning would be taken seriously. They don't want the reconquest of Latin America. We don't want the reconquest of Latin America. And that's kind of what England proposes. Now, when Monroe consults with his advisors, and particularly the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, he basically convinces Monroe we should act alone and issue our own statement. And England's going to support this anyways, because they don't want Spain or any other country to conquer Latin America because they want access to trade. So if we issue our own, we won't be restricted we won't be hampered in potential American expansion in the future. If we form this statement with England, they may put restrictions on our goals, territorially speaking, as we want to expand. So they decide to issue their own statement, and they know that England's going to back it up with that powerful navy of theirs. They got our back. So here's what happens. And in December of 1823, James Monroe, in his annual message to Congress, issues what is known as the Monroe Doctrine. And it's really the work of his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, but we know it as the Monroe Doctrine. He basically says to Europe, no, no. No Europeans supposed to be here. And there's two ideas in this statement, this warning. One, the era of colonization is over. The American continent is closed, and the American continents were not subject for future colonization. If you have colonies still that are under your control, for example, Cuba had not received their independence, that's cool. You can keep that. But you're not reconquering or conquering new territory. It's done. It's over. Off limits. The other piece to this statement is the idea of non-intervention. The United States would not, and in Monroe's words, interfere in the internal concerns of Europe. We're going to stay out of your backyard. You stay out of ours. And keep in mind, this is the result partly of past problems with Europe. We had been kind of dealing with struggling to maintain our neutrality throughout the Napoleonic Wars and even during the early years of the French Revolution. And we're worried about Russia, and we're saying, hey, stay out, colonization has ended. And so basically this is the essential principles outlined in the Monroe Doctrine. Now, important point to keep in mind, especially for you APUSH people out there. There's this perception that in 1823 we issue this Monroe Doctrine and America kind of isolates itself from Europe. We kind of stay within our own little world. And it's not until 1898 during the Spanish-American War that U.S. imperialism kind of begins. But I want to point something out here. Even though in 1823 we issued this Monroe Doctrine, we're busy expanding and conquering. In fact, you could take a look right here. Because a lot of historians, the emphasis is on continuities between early expansion and that which occurred in the early 20th century. The difference is early expansion occurred on the North American continent. So we are going to go to war against Mexico and take a huge chunk of Mexico and greatly increase the size of the United States. We're going to go to war with many Native American tribes, and the Indian Wars are going to be really brutal. So the difference that happens in 1898, expansion goes overseas. Early expansion did exist throughout the 19th century. So if you get a question on that, kind of keep that in mind. And one last thing, the Monroe Doctrine is going to be added to by President Theodore Roosevelt when Roosevelt issues his Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And basically Roosevelt kind of takes it a step further. He says the United States would actively intervene in Latin America. We're going to send Marines in the Navy to occupy countries such as Haiti, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, because we are going to be kind of the police of Latin America. We're going to regulate things, and we're going to use our economic and military strength to do so. And this is going to have a huge impact on relations between the U.S. and Latin America and cause a lot of tension. But keep in mind this idea of expansion and our role in the world. That's going to do it today. Make sure you subscribe to the video, like it, post a comment, and be awesome. Peace.